Sometimes a man chooses solitude not because he hates the world, but because the world has given him too many reasons to walk away. For 15 years, Ezra Thornwell lived alone in the mountains, far from people and their complications. Then one afternoon, a young woman in a tattered wedding dress appeared at his cabin door. She was exhausted, frightened, and carrying a letter that said she was supposed to marry him. But Ezra never sent for a bride. He never wrote to anyone. Someone had brought this woman all the way into the wilderness under false pretenses. Who would do such a thing and why? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountains had a way of marking time differently than the world below. Ezra Thornwell had learned this truth over 15 long years, watching seasons turn like the pages of a book he'd read too many times. At 47, his hands were calloused and scarred, his face weathered by sun and wind until it resembled the ancient pines that surrounded his cabin. His hair had gone mostly gray, though streaks of the dark brown it once was still showed through, like shadows in snow. He stood on his porch that October morning, watching mist rise from the valley below. The air carried the sharp bite of coming winter, and the aspens had turned their brilliant gold, painting the mountainside in colors that reminded him why he'd chosen this place. Up here, beauty didn't ask anything of you. It simply existed, indifferent to human pain or joy. His cabin sat in a small clearing he'd carved from the wilderness with his own hands. The structure was solid, built from logs he'd felled and shaped himself. The door, thick pine reinforced with iron hinges he'd traded for in town years ago, bore the marks of his solitude. Scratch marks from a curious black bear, weathering from countless storms. A bullet hole from the time he'd had to shoot a rabid wolf that had cornered him on his own porch. Every scar told a story, and Ezra knew them all. Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney drawing smoke cleanly even in the worst weather. He'd built shelves for his few books, mostly practical volumes on trapping, wild edibles, and animal behavior. A sturdy table he'd crafted from a single massive oak. 2 chairs, though he'd only ever needed one. A bed in the corner, covered with furs and a quilt his mother had made before she died. He'd carried that quilt with him through everything, unable to part with the only soft thing from his past. The second room served as storage and workshop. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, smoked meat in cloth bags, tools he'd collected or made over the years, traps of various sizes, a small forge where he could repair metal implements or fashion simple items. Everything had its place, and everything served a purpose. There was no room for sentiment up here, except for that quilt and one other thing he kept hidden in a wooden box under his bed. Ezra descended the porch steps and walked to his woodpile. His body moved with the careful efficiency of a man who'd learned to conserve energy. Every motion counted when you lived alone. A twisted ankle could mean death. A careless axe swing could leave you bleeding with no one to help. So he moved deliberately, checking his footing, keeping his tools sharp and his mind sharper. He split wood for an hour, building the rhythm that cleared his thoughts. Swing, split, stack, swing, split, stack. The monotony was a meditation. Up here, time moved in tasks. Gather water, hunt meat, check traps, repair tools, prepare for winter. The cycle repeated endlessly, and within that repetition, he'd found something close to peace, not happiness. He wasn't sure he remembered what happiness felt like anymore. But peace, yes. The mountains offered that much. He'd come here 15 years ago with nothing but a pack on his back, a rifle in his hands, and a heart so broken he'd thought it might actually stop beating. His wife, Margaret, had looked at him with such hatred in those final days. Their daughter, Emma, had been only 8 months old when the fever took her. Such a small thing to lose so much. A fever that wouldn't break. A town doctor who arrived too late. A tiny body that grew still in his arms, while Margaret screamed accusations that cut deeper than any blade. You should have gone for help sooner. You should have known. You killed her with your stubbornness. You and your pride, always thinking you can handle everything yourself. Maybe she'd been right. Maybe if he'd ridden through the night instead of waiting until morning, thinking the fever would break on its own. Maybe if he'd been a better father, a better husband, a better man. He'd left 6 months after they buried Emma. The marriage had died with their daughter, slowly suffocating under the weight of blame and grief. Margaret had family in Missouri. She'd gone to them, and he'd never heard from her again. Hadn't tried to contact her either. What would he say? The silence between them had said everything that mattered. So he'd walked into these mountains and built a life from nothing. The first year had been hell. He'd nearly starved twice, nearly froze once, and had seriously considered eating a bullet on a particularly dark January night. But something stubborn in him refused to quit. Maybe it was pride, the same pride Margaret had cursed. Maybe it was cowardice, afraid to face whatever judgment might wait on the other side. Or maybe he just wasn't done punishing himself yet. The second year had been easier. He'd learned which plants were edible, where the game trails ran, how to read weather in the clouds and animal behavior. He'd learned to be alone with his thoughts, to sit with his grief until it became something he could carry without it crushing him. The mountains had taught him that lesson. Everything here carried weight, snow on branches, water in storms, the bulk of a bull elk. You learned to bear it or you broke. By the 5th year, he'd stopped counting days. Time became seasons, and seasons became years, and the years piled up like snow. He made one trip to Timber Ridge each autumn, to trade furs for supplies, ammunition, salt, tobacco, coffee, the few things he couldn't make or find himself. The town had grown some, but he never stayed long. People asked too many questions, and he had no answers he wanted to share. The last time he'd gone to town was 5 years ago. A new marshal had tried to recruit him for some posse, and Ezra had made it clear he wanted no part of other people's troubles. He'd stocked up extra that year, stretching his supplies, making do. The isolation had grown deeper, but that was fine. That was what he wanted, or so he'd told himself. He finished stacking the wood and wiped his brow with his sleeve. The sun had climbed higher, burning off the morning mist. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals with lazy grace. Ezra watched it for a moment, envying its freedom. Hawks didn't carry regrets. They simply lived hunting and soaring and nesting without the weight of memory. His stomach reminded him he hadn't eaten. So he went inside and fixed a simple breakfast. Fried salt pork, cornbread from yesterday, coffee so strong it could strip paint. He ate standing at the window, looking out at his small kingdom. A garden plot, now mostly harvested and put to bed for winter. A root cellar dug into the hillside. A small corral where he kept his 2 horses, both sturdy mountain breeds that could handle the rough terrain. A mule for packing supplies. After breakfast, he checked his traps. He had a dozen scattered through the woods within a few miles of the cabin. The work took most of the morning. 3 rabbits, 1 marten with a beautiful pelt. He reset the traps and headed home, taking the long route past the stream where he liked to fish. The water ran clear and cold, tumbling over smooth stones worn down by centuries of current. Ezra knelt and drank from his cupped hands, tasting the mineral sharpness of snowmelt. This water came from somewhere high above, born in some hidden spring near the peaks. It flowed through his life and continued down the mountain, eventually joining some river he'd never seen, flowing toward some ocean he'd left behind when he came here. He was about to stand when he noticed boot prints in the soft mud near the bank. Not his own. These were smaller, and the tread pattern was wrong. Someone had been here recently, maybe this morning. Ezra's senses sharpened immediately. Poachers sometimes ventured this high, though they rarely came this far from established trails. Could be hunters from town, though this was his territory, and most people knew to stay clear. Could be someone lost, though that seemed unlikely. The prince headed upstream toward his cabin. He moved quickly but quietly, following the trail. The prints were fresh enough that water was still seeping into the deepest impressions. Whoever made them was close. As he climbed higher, he noticed other signs, a broken branch here, a disturbed rock there. Whoever this was, they weren't trying to hide their passage. Either they didn't care, or they didn't know how. When he reached the ridge above his cabin, he stopped and studied the clearing below. Nothing seemed disturbed. The horses stood calmly in the corral. No smoke from the chimney except the normal trace from the banked coals he'd left. But something felt wrong. That instinct he'd developed over 15 years of survival was whispering warnings he couldn't quite articulate. He circled wide, approaching the cabin from the back where he had a clear view of the porch. That's when he saw her. A woman sat slumped against his door, head bowed, absolutely still. She wore what had once been a white dress. A wedding dress, he realized with shock, now stained with mud and torn in several places. Her dark hair had come loose from whatever style it had been arranged in, hanging in tangled waves around her shoulders. A small suitcase sat beside her, looking as battered and exhausted as she did. Ezra froze, his mind racing. In 15 years, no one had come to his cabin uninvited. No one knew exactly where it was, except a few old-timers in Timber Ridge who respected his privacy. And certainly no woman in a wedding dress had ever appeared on his doorstep. He watched for a long moment, rifle ready, looking for any sign of a trap. Was she bait? Were there others hidden in the trees? But the forest was quiet except for normal sounds. Birds calling, wind in the pines, the distant chatter of a squirrel. If this was an ambush, it was the strangest one he'd ever encountered. The woman stirred slightly, and he heard a sound that made his chest tighten, a quiet, hopeless sob against every instinct that told him to stay hidden. To let this problem solve itself by having her leave, Ezra stepped out of the trees. His boots crunched on fallen leaves, and her head snapped up. Even from a distance, he could see her face was pale with exhaustion, her eyes red from crying. "You're on private property," he said, keeping his voice level and his rifle pointed at the ground but ready. "Time for you to move along." She struggled to her feet, swaying slightly, and he realized she was close to collapse. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse, as if she'd been calling for help for hours. "Are you Ezra Thornwell?" The sound of his own name, spoken by a stranger in a wedding dress on his porch, sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the October air. "Who's asking?" he replied, moving closer but keeping his distance. She reached into the bodice of her ruined dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper, holding it toward him with a trembling hand. "I'm Catherine Mercer," she said, and her voice broke. "I've come from St. Louis to marry you." Ezra stared at the woman for a long moment, certain he'd misheard her. The wind picked up, sending dried leaves skittering across the porch between them, and still he said nothing. His mind had gone blank, unable to process what she'd just said. "You've come to what?" He finally managed. Catherine took a shaky step forward, still holding out the paper. "To marry you. We've been corresponding for 3 months. You sent for me. You said—" her voice caught. "You said you wanted a wife, someone to share your life up here. Lady, I don't know what kind of game this is, but I never sent for anyone." Ezra kept his rifle lowered but his stance ready. "I don't write letters. I don't correspond with anyone. And I sure as hell don't want a wife." Her face crumpled, and for a terrible moment he thought she might faint. She grabbed the porch railing to steady herself. "That's not possible. I have your letters, months of them. You told me about your cabin, about the mountains, about your life here. You knew things, details that—" "Let me see that paper," Ezra interrupted, stepping onto the porch. He kept his distance, taking the letter from her outstretched hand without getting too close. The page was creased and worn, as if she'd read it many times. He unfolded it carefully and began to read. The handwriting was neat, practiced, nothing like his own rough scrawl. But the words made his blood run cold. "Dear Miss Mercer, I hope this letter finds you well. As we discussed in our previous correspondence, I believe the time has come for you to make the journey west. I have prepared my home for your arrival and await the day when you will become my wife. The cabin sits in a high valley surrounded by pine and aspen. There is a stream nearby where the water runs clear and cold. I have built everything with my own hands, and though life here is simple, it is honest. I believe you will find peace in these mountains, as I have. Take the stage to Timber Ridge and hire a guide to bring you to Thornwell Creek. Any local will know the way. I will be waiting With anticipation, Ezra Thornwell, he read it twice, his jaw tightening with each word. Someone had used his name. Someone had known enough about his location to make it convincing. But the tone was all wrong, flowery, almost romantic. He'd never written anything like that in his life. "This isn't from me," he said flatly, handing the letter back. "I don't know who wrote it, but it wasn't me." Catherine's face had gone from pale to ashen. "But I have others. Dozens of them. We've been writing since July. You told me about losing your daughter, about coming to the mountains to heal. You said you were ready to try again, to build something new." Each word hit him like a physical blow. Whoever had written those letters knew things they shouldn't. Private things. Things he'd told no one. "Show me the others," he demanded. She bent to open her suitcase with trembling hands. And he noticed for the first time how thin she was, how the dress, clearly once expensive, hung loose on her frame. She pulled out a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon and handed them to him. Ezra untied the ribbon and began reading, his anger building with each page. The imposter had created an entire fiction, weaving in just enough truth to make it believable. References to the mountains he loved, mentions of his past pain, though twisted into something softer, more palatable. Promises of a simple but good life, of partnership and respect. "How did you respond to these?" he asked, looking up from the letters. "I sent mine to the post office in Timber Ridge, care of Ezra Thornwell, like you, like he, instructed." She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering in the cold. "I told him about my life in St. Louis. I worked as a seamstress. My parents died when I was 17. I've been alone for 11 years, barely making enough to survive. When his first letter came, it seemed like providence, like God was finally answering my prayers." The desperation in her voice was genuine, and despite his anger at the situation, Ezra felt an unwilling stir of pity. She'd been tricked, used by someone for reasons he couldn't fathom yet. "You came all this way alone?" he asked. "I sold everything I owned to pay for passage. The stage brought me to Timber Ridge yesterday morning. I asked about hiring a guide, but it was expensive, and I'd spent nearly all my money on the journey. The stable master said it wasn't far, that I could walk it in a few hours if I followed Thornwell Creek upstream." She laughed bitterly. "It took me all day and most of the night. I got lost twice. I heard wolves. I thought I was going to die out there." Ezra cursed under his breath. The stable master in Timber Ridge was old Bill Hawkins, and he knew damn well it was at least a 6-hour walk from town to this cabin, through rough country that could kill someone who didn't know what they were doing. "You're lucky you didn't freeze or fall off a cliff," he said roughly. "This isn't country for someone who doesn't know their way." "I know that now," she replied, and there was an edge of anger breaking through her exhaustion. "But what was I supposed to do? I came here in good faith. I believed," her voice broke again, "I believed someone actually wanted me, that I was going somewhere better." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of broken promises and cruel deceptions. Catherine stood there in her ruined wedding dress, clutching that suitcase like it held her last hope. And Ezra felt the walls he'd built over 15 years cracking in ways he didn't appreciate. "Come inside," he finally said, turning toward the door. "You're half frozen and you look like you haven't eaten in days. We'll figure out what happens next, but first you need food and warmth." He pushed open the heavy cabin door, the one that bore all those marks of his solitary years, and held it for her. She hesitated, clearly unsure whether to trust him, and he didn't blame her. Her day had started with the hope of a new life, and had crashed into this nightmare. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, softer than he'd spoken in years. "But you can't stay out here. Temperature's dropping fast, and you're in no shape to make it back to town tonight." Catherine picked up her suitcase and stepped inside. The cabin's warmth enveloped her immediately, and she sagged with relief. Ezra gestured to one of the chairs by the fireplace. "Sit, I'll get the fire built up and make some food." He moved through his familiar routines, adding wood to the fire, putting coffee on to boil, slicing bread and cold venison. The simple tasks gave him time to think. Someone had orchestrated this elaborate scheme, and it had to be someone who knew him, or knew enough about him to make those letters convincing. But why? What was the point of bringing a woman from St. Louis to his cabin under false pretenses? It made no sense, unless, the thought struck him cold, unless someone was trying to draw him out, to make him come looking for answers. Or maybe they wanted to know where he lived, and Catherine was meant to report back. But she seemed genuinely devastated, not like someone playing a part. He carried food and coffee to the table and sat across from her. She ate mechanically, barely tasting the food, her eyes distant and haunted. "Tell me everything," Ezra said. "Start from the beginning. When did you receive the first letter?" Catherine set down her coffee cup and began to speak. The story that emerged was carefully crafted deception, letters that had arrived weekly, building a relationship, creating trust. The writer had been patient, taking months to establish credibility before suggesting marriage. He'd even sent money once, when Catherine mentioned being short on rent, which had cemented her belief that he was genuine. "How much did this wedding dress cost you?" Ezra asked, eyeing the expensive fabric beneath the mud stains. "More than I should have spent," she admitted quietly. "But he said, the letters said, that you wanted a proper wedding when I arrived, that we'd marry in Timber Ridge before coming up here. I wanted to look right. I wanted—" She stopped, unable to continue. Ezra stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening forest. Behind him, he heard Catherine crying softly, trying to muffle the sound. "You can stay tonight," he said without turning around. "Tomorrow, when you've rested, we'll go to Timber Ridge together. Someone there has to know something about who sent those letters. And when I find out who did this—" He let the threat hang unfinished. "Why would someone do this?" Catherine asked. "What could they possibly gain?" That was the question that troubled him most. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a name was beginning to surface, a ghost from his past he'd thought was long buried. But he didn't share that thought. Not yet, not until he was sure. "Get some rest," he told her. "You can have the bed. I'll sleep on the floor by the fire." "I can't take your bed," she protested. "You can and you will. Don't argue with me on this." His tone left no room for discussion. Catherine nodded wearily and moved toward the bed in the corner. Ezra turned back to the window, studying his reflection in the glass. Behind him, he could see her sitting on the edge of the bed, still wearing that ruined wedding dress, still clutching those lying letters. Somewhere out there in the darkness, someone was laughing at both of them. And Ezra Thornwell was going to find out who and why, even if it meant leaving the safety of his mountains for the first time in 5 years. Morning came with frost on the windows, and Catherine still asleep in his bed, curled beneath his mother's quilt. Ezra had dozed fitfully by the fire, waking every hour or so to add wood and check that she was still breathing. Old habits from his years of solitude made deep sleep difficult when another person was present. He rose before dawn and moved quietly through his morning routine, stoking the fire, putting coffee on, preparing a more substantial breakfast than usual. Eggs from his chickens, fried potatoes, the last of yesterday's bread toasted over the flames. As he cooked, he found himself glancing at the woman in his bed, noting details he'd missed in yesterday's chaos. She was younger than he'd first thought, probably late 20s. Dark hair that would be lovely when cleaned and brushed. Delicate features that spoke of someone who'd known hardship, but hadn't let it make her hard. Her hands, visible above the quilt, were scarred and calloused, working hands. That detail interested him. Whatever else she wasn't a pampered city woman. Catherine stirred as the smell of coffee filled the cabin. She sat up slowly, disoriented, and Ezra saw the moment memory returned. Her face fell as she remembered where she was and why. "Morning," he said gruffly, not sure what else to say. "Food's ready." She stood, smoothing the ruined wedding dress self-consciously. "I must look terrible." "You look like someone who had a hard day yesterday." He poured coffee into 2 tin cups. "There's a wash basin on the table there, and water in the kettle if you want to clean up." "Thank you." She moved to the basin and washed her face and hands, and he noticed she did it efficiently, without fuss. Another point in her favor. He'd expected tears this morning, maybe hysteria, but she seemed to be pulling herself together with quiet determination. They ate in awkward silence. neither quite knowing how to navigate this strange situation. Finally, Catherine set down her fork and spoke. "I want to see all the letters again," she said. "The ones you have and the ones I brought. If we're going to find who did this, we need to understand what they knew and how they knew it." Ezra nodded, grudgingly impressed by her practical thinking. He'd expected her to spend the morning feeling sorry for herself, but instead she was already trying to solve the problem. He retrieved the bundle from where he'd left it on the shelf and brought it to the table, along with the first letter she'd shown him. They spread the papers out, arranging them in chronological order. There were 37 letters in total, spanning from early July to late September. Catherine produced her own letters, copies she'd made before sending the originals. "I learned to keep copies of important correspondence," she explained, seeing his questioning look. "My mother taught me that. She said you never know when you might need proof of what was said." Smart woman, Ezra thought. He began reading through the exchange, and the picture that emerged made his skin crawl. The imposter had been meticulous, building a fictional version of Ezra Thornwell that was close enough to the truth to be convincing, but softened around all the rough edges. The real Ezra was harsh, withdrawn, carrying wounds that would never fully heal. The fictional Ezra was a thoughtful man who'd retreated to the mountains to heal, but was now ready to rejoin the world of the living. Someone noble and romantic instead of broken and bitter. "Look at this part," Catherine said, pointing to a letter dated August 15th. Whoever he is, mentions the daughter you lost. He says her name was Emma and that she died of fever when she was 8 months old." "That's very specific." Ezra felt his chest tighten. "Those are facts. True facts. But I never told anyone up here about Emma. When I came to these mountains, I left that life behind." "So whoever wrote these letters knew you from before," Catherine reasoned. "From your old life, maybe." Ezra stood and paced to the window, his mind working through possibilities. "Or they talked to someone who knew me then. My wife had family. I had a few friends before everything fell apart. Could be any of them. Why would they do this, though?" Catherine pressed. "What's the purpose of bringing me here? If they wanted to hurt you, there are easier ways." That was the question that had kept him awake most of the night. He turned to face her, studying her carefully. "Tell me about the money he sent. When was that and how much?" Catherine's cheeks colored slightly. "It was in mid-August. $50. I'd written about having trouble with rent, and the next letter included the money. He said he wanted to help, that we were going to be family soon. $50. That was substantial, more than most working men made in a month. Whoever was behind this had resources, and you sent all your responses to Timber Ridge." Ezra confirmed, "Yes, to the post office there. He said someone collected his mail for him, since he rarely came to town." She paused. "Actually, that should have seemed strange to me, shouldn't it? Why would someone who lives in such isolation have mail collected regularly?" "Because it was a lie," Ezra said flatly. "Everything was a lie, crafted to bring you here. The question is why." He pulled his suitcase, battered leather with brass corners, across the table. "What else is in here?" "Maybe there's something that will tell us more." Catherine opened it and began removing items. Practical clothing, simple dresses, a warm coat, sturdy boots. A sewing kit with professional quality tools. A small book of poetry. And at the bottom, wrapped in cloth, a tintype photograph in a frame. "My parents," she said softly, holding it up. The image showed a stern-looking man and a gentle-faced woman standing stiffly before a photographer's backdrop. "This is all I have left of them." Ezra felt an unwelcome pang of sympathy. He knew what it was like to lose everything that mattered. They looked like good people. They were. "My father was a carpenter. My mother took in sewing. They worked themselves to death trying to give me a better life than they had." She set the photograph down carefully. "When they died within 6 months of each other, I thought I'd die too. I was 17 and completely alone. I learned to sew from my mother, found work at a dress shop, and survived. But I never stopped being alone." The admission hung in the air between them. Ezra understood loneliness. It had been his companion for 15 years. But he'd chosen it. Catherine had had it thrust upon her. "That's why the letters worked," he said quietly. Whoever wrote them knew exactly what to say to someone desperate for connection. I wasn't desperate, Catherine said defensively, then deflated. All right, maybe I was. When you spend 11 years with no family, no real friends, working dawn to dusk just to afford a room in a boarding house, yes, I was desperate. Desperate enough to believe someone might actually want me. Ezra sat back down across from her. You're not stupid for believing. You're human. Whoever did this, they're the one who should be ashamed, not you. She looked up at him, surprised by the gentleness in his voice. Thank you for saying that. They returned to the letters, reading more carefully now, looking for clues. It was Catherine who spotted the first significant detail. Look at the postmarks, she said, gathering several envelopes. They're all from Timber Ridge, but look at the dates. Every single letter was posted on a Wednesday. Not Monday or Friday or any other day, always Wednesday. Ezra leaned in to examine them. She was right. Every letter, spanning 3 months, had been posted on Wednesday. That's a pattern. Maybe whoever is doing this comes to town on a specific day. A schedule of some kind. Or they have someone else posting them, Catherine suggested. Maybe they're not even in Timber Ridge. Maybe they're somewhere else entirely, sending the letters to an accomplice who posts them. Smart thinking. Ezra found himself reassessing this woman. She wasn't just a victim. She had a sharp mind and wasn't afraid to use it. There's something else, he said, pulling out one of the later letters. This one mentions the Harvest Festival in Timber Ridge. Says I'd be coming to town for it this year, and maybe we could marry then. But I haven't been to a harvest festival in 5 years. I avoid those gatherings specifically. So whoever wrote it doesn't know your current habits, Catherine said. They know your past, but not your present. That narrows it down, doesn't it? It did. Ezra felt the pieces starting to form a picture, though he couldn't see the whole thing yet. Someone from his past with money and patience, who knew intimate details about his old life, but didn't know he'd become a complete hermit. Someone who wanted Catherine in these mountains badly enough to spend months and considerable money making it happen. But why? That question still had no answer. We'll go to Timber Ridge today, Ezra decided. Talk to the postmaster, see if we can find out who collected these letters. But first, he stood and went to his storage room, returning with clothes. You can't walk around in that dress. These were... He hesitated. They belonged to my wife. She left them when she went to Missouri. You're about the same size. You're welcome to them. Catherine took the clothes with obvious relief. Thank you. I'll take good care of them. They've been sitting in a trunk for 15 years. Better they get used. He turned away to give her privacy. Change and we'll head out. It's a long walk to town. 3 days passed before they made the journey to Timber Ridge. The weather turned foul that first afternoon, bringing an early snow that made travel dangerous. Catherine proved surprisingly adaptable to cabin life during those days, and Ezra found his initial resistance to her presence slowly eroding. She insisted on helping with chores, and despite his protests, she demonstrated a competence that surprised him. She knew how to cook over an open fire, having grown up poor. She could mend his worn clothes with professional skill. She even helped him split wood, though he made her use the smaller axe and supervised closely. My father taught me basic carpentry, she explained, stacking split logs with efficient movements. Said a woman should know how to take care of herself. My mother thought it was scandalous, but she didn't stop him. Smart man, Ezra acknowledged. He found himself watching her more than he should, noting the way she approached each task with focused determination. There was steel beneath her quiet exterior. On the second evening, they sat by the fire after supper, and Ezra found himself really talking, for the first time in years. Maybe it was the forced intimacy of the cabin. Maybe it was knowing she'd been deceived by his story anyway. Or maybe he was just tired of carrying everything alone. Emma died in my arms, he said quietly, staring into the flames. Margaret had been trying to cool her fever all day. I kept saying it would break, that babies got fevers all the time. I didn't want to admit how bad it was. By the time I rode for the doctor, it was too late. Catherine said nothing, just listened. He appreciated that. She didn't try to comfort him or say things would have been different. She just let him speak. Margaret blamed me, and she was right to. I was stubborn and stupid, thinking I knew better than I did. Our marriage didn't survive it. How could it? Every time she looked at me, she saw the man who let our daughter die. You didn't let her die, Catherine said softly. You made a mistake in judgment, but you didn't kill her. Viva kills children. It's cruel and random and not your fault. Tell that to Margaret. Tell that to the man I see in the mirror. He pulled something from his pocket, a small pocket watch, tarnished silver with delicate engraving. He opened it and Catherine leaned closer to see. Inside was a tiny daguerreotype of a baby girl with dark eyes and a wisp of hair. This stopped at the exact moment she died, Ezra said. 3 a.m, April 22nd. I've never wound it again. Can't bring myself to do it. Catherine reached out slowly, as if asking permission, and when he didn't pull away, she touched the watch gently. She was beautiful. She was everything. His voice cracked. I came up here because I couldn't stand to be around people anymore. Couldn't stand their pity or their judgment or their attempts to make me feel better. But mostly I couldn't stand myself. Figured I'd live up here alone and that would be punishment enough. And has it been? Catherine asked. Punishment, I mean? Ezra considered the question. For the first few years, yes. Every day was hard. The isolation, the survival, the long nights with nothing but regrets for company. But then he paused, surprised by his own revelation. Then it became something else. Not happiness, but not punishment either. Just existence. Days passing one after another until I stopped feeling much of anything. That sounds lonely. It was supposed to be. They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire dance and crack. Finally, Catherine spoke again. I understand loneliness. Maybe not the same as yours, but I understand it. After my parents died, I worked at that dress shop for 11 years. Same people every day, but none of them really knew me. I'd go home to my boarding house room and realize I could disappear and no one would notice for days. Maybe weeks. Is that why you believed the letters? Ezra asked. Because you wanted someone to notice you? Yes, but also because they promised something I'd given up on, family. Not just a husband, but the idea of building something with someone. Children, maybe. A home that was really mine. All the things I thought I'd never have. Ezra felt the weight of that confession. Whoever had written those letters had understood exactly what Catherine needed to hear. They'd crafted the perfect lie for a lonely woman's desperate hope. I'm sorry you were used like that, he said. You deserved better. So did you, she replied, and he realized she meant more than just the letter scheme. She meant Margaret's blame, his self-imposed exile, all of it. The moment stretched between them, intimate in a way that made Ezra uncomfortable. He stood abruptly, breaking the spell. We'll leave for Timber Ridge at first light, if the weather holds. Get some rest. But that night, as he lay by the fire and listened to Catherine breathing in his bed, Ezra found himself winding the pocket watch for the first time in 15 years. The mechanism was stiff, but still functional. He set it to the correct time, listening to its steady tick in the darkness. It felt like letting go of something he'd held too long. Not forgetting Emma. He'd never forget her, but maybe forgiving himself enough to keep living. The next morning dawned clear and cold. They set out for Timber Ridge on foot, since Ezra's horses weren't used to carrying 2 riders, and he wanted to keep them fresh. Catherine wore Margaret's old traveling dress and coat, and with her hair braided back, she looked every bit the frontier woman. How far is it? She asked as they followed the trail down from the high valley. 6 hours if we keep a good pace. We'll stop at Harker's Creek to rest and eat. The walk gave them time to talk more, and Ezra found himself sharing stories about the mountains, which plants were edible, how to read animal tracks, why certain trees grew where they did. Catherine listened with genuine interest, asking intelligent questions. You love it up here, she observed. Not just the isolation, but the place itself. I do, he admitted. It's the only place I've felt at peace since Emma died. Up here, everything makes sense. Animals hunt or get hunted. Trees grow or fall. Snow melts and becomes streams. There's a logic to it that human life lacks. But it's also lonely, Catherine said. You can have peace and still be lonely. He couldn't argue with that. They reached Timber Ridge in late afternoon. The town had grown since Ezra's last visit 5 years ago. New buildings lined the main street, and there were more people about than he remembered. The sight of so many folks made him tense, his hand unconsciously checking that his rifle was ready. "Easy," Catherine murmured beside him. "Just people going about their business." He appreciated her steadying presence more than he'd admit. They headed straight for the post office, a small building near the general store. Inside, a middle-aged man with spectacles looked up from sorting mail. "Help you?" He stopped mid-sentence, staring at Ezra. "Well, I'll be damned." "Ezra Thornwell. Been years since you darkened this door." "Hello, George." Ezra remembered the postmaster from his few visits to town. "Need to ask you some questions about mail being collected under my name." George's expression shifted to wariness. "What kind of questions?" Catherine stepped forward and produced the bundle of letters. "Someone has been writing to me for 3 months, claiming to be Mr. Thornwell, and collecting his responses through this post office. We need to know who." George examined the letters, his frown deepening. "These postmarks are from here, all right. But Ezra, you know I can't just give out information about mail collection. Privacy concerns." "Someone used my name to commit fraud," Ezra said flatly. "Brought this woman all the way from St. Louis under false pretenses. Now you can tell me what I need to know, or I can go get Marshal Blackwood and make this official." "Your choice." George hesitated, clearly torn between policy and practicality. Finally he sighed. "All right. Wait here." He disappeared into the back room and returned with a large ledger. He flipped through pages, running his finger down columns of entries. "Here," he said, pointing to a series of notations. "Mail for Ezra Thornwell, collected every Wednesday for the past 4 months. Paid in advance for collection service." "Who collected it?" Catherine asked. George looked uncomfortable. "Name given was Thomas Mercer," Catherine gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Ezra grabbed her arm to steady her. "What is it?" he demanded. "That's my father's name," she whispered. "Thomas Mercer was my father's name." The revelation hit them both like a physical blow. Ezra guided Catherine to a chair near the post office window, while George watched with growing concern. "Your father's been dead for years, right?" Ezra asked gently. Catherine nodded, her face pale. 11 years. He died of pneumonia in the winter of '62. My mother followed 6 months later. Someone is using his name, his identity. George flipped through his ledger again, his expression troubled. The man who came in was young, maybe mid-20s. Polite, well-dressed. Paid in cash every time. Said he was collecting mail for you as a favor, Ezra, since you rarely came to town. Can you describe him more specifically? Ezra pressed. Medium height, dark hair, clean-shaven. Spoke well, educated sounding. Wore good clothes, nothing fancy but quality fabric. Had a scar here. George traced a line along his left cheekbone, like maybe from a knife fight or accident. The description meant nothing to Ezra. He'd known no one fitting that profile in his old life. But someone who knew both his past and Catherine's father's name that required access to information most people wouldn't have. Did he ever mention where he was staying? Catherine asked, her voice steadier now. He mentioned the Sawyer boarding house once or twice. Said he was in town on business. George closed his ledger. I'm sorry, miss. If I'd known this was some kind of scheme, I never would have cooperated. You weren't to know, Ezra assured him. You have any idea where this man might be now? I haven't seen him in 2 weeks. Last collection was... George consulted his records. September 20th. He picked up your final letter to Miss Mercer and hasn't been back since. That timing made sense. The last letter had told Catherine to come to Timber Ridge, that everything was ready for her arrival. Once she was on her way, the imposter had no more need for the post office. We need to talk to Marshal Blackwood, Ezra decided, and check that boarding house. They found Marshal Henry Blackwood at his office, a solid man in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He listened to their story with increasing concern, occasionally jotting notes in a small book. So someone orchestrated an elaborate fraud using both your identities, he summarized when they finished. Brought Miss Mercer across country to your cabin under false pretenses. The question is why? That's what we're trying to figure out, Ezra said. George at the post office said the man might have stayed at Sawyer's. Blackwood nodded. I'll come with you. Mrs. Sawyer knows everything. that happens under her roof. The Sawyer boarding house was a neat, two-story building at the edge of town. Mrs. Sawyer herself answered the door, a formidable woman with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her eyes widened when she saw Ezra Thornwell. "Haven't seen you in an age." Then her gaze shifted to Catherine and grew speculative. "And who might this be?" "Miss Catherine Mercer," Ezra said. "We need to ask you about one of your recent guests. Young man, mid-20s, dark hair, scar on his cheek. Might have been here for several months." Recognition flashed across Mrs. Sawyer's face. "Mr. Thomas Mercer. Said he was your friend's son, Ezra. Stayed here from June through late September. Quiet fellow, kept regular hours. Paid on time, never caused trouble." Catherine's hands clenched in her lap. Hearing her father's name used so casually by this stranger made the violation even worse. "Did he mention what brought him to Timber Ridge?" Marshal Blackwood asked. "Said he was doing research of some kind. Historical research. Asked a lot of questions about the area, about families who'd lived here a long time. Seemed particularly interested in—" She paused, looking at Ezra. "In you, actually. Asked about your cabin, your habits, when you came to town. And you told him?" Ezra asked, trying to keep the accusation from his voice. "Didn't see the harm," Mrs. Sawyer said defensively. "He said he was writing a book about mountain settlers, wanted to include your story. Seemed like a legitimate endeavor." Ezra exchanged a look with Marshal Blackwood. The imposter had been thorough, building a cover story that would encourage people to talk about him. "Did he leave anything behind?" Catherine asked. "Any papers, belongings?" "Took everything when he left." "But—" Mrs. Sawyer hesitated. "I did find something odd when I cleaned his room." "Wait here." She disappeared upstairs and returned a few minutes later with a small leather-bound book. "Found this wedged behind the dresser. Looks like it fell and got stuck. Might be nothing." Marshal Blackwood took the book and opened it carefully. His expression darkened as he read. "This is a journal. Entries dating back to June." He looked at Ezra. "You're going to want to read this." They returned to the marshal's office, and Blackwood spread the journal on his desk. The handwriting was the same neat script from the letters to Catherine. As they read, a disturbing picture emerged. The journal detailed a plan, cold, calculated, and deeply personal. The writer had tracked Ezra's movements for months before coming to Timber Ridge. He'd researched Catherine through St. Louis church records and employment offices, specifically looking for someone vulnerable and desperate. The entire scheme had been designed to bring them together, though the reason why remained maddeningly vague. "Listen to this entry from July 10th, Marshal Blackwood read aloud. "The woman is perfect for our purposes. Alone, desperate, with enough intelligence to follow instructions, but too desperate to question the opportunity too closely. Once she arrives at the cabin, Ezra will have no choice but to engage with the situation. That engagement is all we need." "Engagement with what?" Catherine asked, her voice tight with anger. "What were they trying to accomplish?" Ezra turned pages, searching for answers. Near the end of the journal, he found something that made his blood run cold. "Here," he said, pointing to an entry dated September 15th. "It says, 'Once the woman arrives, Ezra will come to town seeking answers. That's when the others will move into position. He hasn't seen Samuel in 20 years. He has no idea his brother is alive, let alone what Samuel has become.'" The name hit Ezra like a physical blow. Samuel, his younger brother, who he'd thought was dead for 2 decades. "You have a brother?" Catherine asked quietly. Ezra sat down heavily, his mind reeling. I thought I had a brother. Samuel was 10 years younger than me. Wild, rebellious, always getting into trouble. When I was 27 and he was 17, he got mixed up with some bad people. Outlaws passing through. They robbed a stage, killed the driver. Samuel was with them. What happened? Marshal Blackwood prompted. I tried to help him. Went to the sheriff, explained Samuel was young and stupid, asked if there was any way to make a deal. The sheriff said if Samuel testified against the others, he might avoid hanging. But Samuel... Ezra's jaw clenched. Samuel disappeared before I could talk to him. Never saw him again. 6 months later, I heard he'd been killed in a shootout in Kansas. Never questioned it. Figured it was the end he was heading toward anyway. But he didn't die, Catherine said, understanding dawning. He's alive, and somehow he's behind all this. Marshal Blackwood flipped through more pages. There's mention here of a gang. Says they're planning something significant. The timing had to be perfect, which is why they needed you in town, Ezra. Planning what? Ezra demanded. The marshal found the entry, and his face went grim. Bank robbery. They're planning to rob Timber Ridge Bank during the Harvest Festival. That's 3 days from now. The pieces suddenly clicked into place for Ezra. Samuel hadn't just orchestrated an elaborate revenge scheme. He'd found a way to get Ezra away from his mountain sanctuary and into town at a specific time. But why? What did Ezra's presence have to do with a bank robbery? There's more, Blackwood said, his voice low. Says here they plan to frame you for the robbery, Ezra. Make it look like you organized the whole thing. You've been isolated for 15 years. You're known to be unfriendly. You suddenly show up in town right before a major crime. They figured people would believe it. Catherine's hand found Ezra's arm. That's why they brought me here. To force you to come to town, to be seen here right before the robbery. You'd be the perfect scapegoat. Ezra felt rage building in his chest, cold and focused. His own brother, his own blood, had orchestrated this betrayal, had used an innocent woman as bait, had planned to destroy what little life Ezra had built for himself. How many men in this gang? He asked Marshal Blackwood. Journal mentions 8, including Samuel. Calls them experienced, dangerous. Says they've pulled successful jobs in 3 territories. Blackwood closed the journal. Ezra, I need to ask you straight. Will you help me stop this? You think I'd let my brother frame me for robbery and terrorize this town? Ezra's voice was hard as stone. I'll help, but I want something in return. Name it. When this is over, when Samuel and his gang are dealt with. I want to talk to my brother, alone. I need to know why he's doing this. Blackwood considered, then nodded. If he survives, you'll get your chance. Now we have 3 days to prepare. This journal gives us an advantage. They don't know we know they're coming. What do you need from me? Ezra asked. Your mountain skills, your knowledge of tactics and ambush. You were a cavalry scout, according to Mrs. Sawyer's gossip. That true? Ezra nodded reluctantly. 10 years before I settled down and married. Tracked Comanche, Apache deserters. I know how to read terrain and set traps. Good, because we're going to turn their ambush around on them. Blackwood stood and moved to a map of Timber Ridge on his wall. The Harvest Festival draws people from all the outlying farms. Main Street will be crowded. Bank will have extra deposits from farmers selling their crops. It's a perfect target. They'll hit it during peak crowd time, Ezra observed, studying the map. Use the chaos as cover. That's my thinking too. So we set up a counter-strategy. Make them think everything is proceeding as planned, then close the trap. Blackwood looked at Catherine. Miss Mercer, I'm going to ask you to stay somewhere safe during all this. Absolutely not, Catherine said firmly. They used me as bait to hurt Ezra. I'm seeing this through. It'll be dangerous, Ezra warned. So was walking through the wilderness alone to reach your cabin, and I survived that. Her eyes held steel. I can shoot. My father taught me when I was young. Put a rifle in my hands and I can help. Ezra found himself looking at her with new respect. This wasn't the broken woman who'd collapsed on his porch. This was someone who'd been knocked down and had decided to stand back up fighting. All right, Marshal Blackwood said. But you follow orders exactly. No heroics. Agreed? Agreed, Catherine said. They spent the next hour going over details, making plans. Ezra suggested defensive positions, fields of fire, escape routes. His military training came back easily. Muscle memory of tactics and strategy he hadn't used in decades. As darkness fell, Blackwood arranged for them to stay at the boarding house. Separate rooms, he emphasized with a pointed look. Catherine retired early, exhausted from the day's revelations. Ezra stood on the boarding house porch, looking up at the mountains where his cabin waited. 3 days ago, he'd been alone and at peace, or something close to it. Now he was drawn back into the world of violence and betrayal he'd tried so hard to escape. But when he thought about Catherine upstairs, manipulated and used by Samuel's scheme, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years, the desire to protect someone other than himself. Tomorrow they'd start preparing, and in 3 days he'd face his brother and whatever demons Samuel had been carrying all these years. The mountains seemed very far away. The next morning brought troubling news. Marshal Blackwood arrived at the boarding house as Ezra and Catherine were finishing breakfast, his face grim. "Had visitors last night," he said, keeping his voice low. "3 men came into the Dusty Trail saloon, asking questions about you, Ezra. Rough types, armed. Bartender said they wanted to know if you'd been seen in town, where you might be staying." "Samuel's men," Ezra said, checking to see if their plan worked. "That's my thinking. They're in position, waiting for the festival." Blackwood pulled out a chair and sat. "But there's something else. One of them asked specifically about a woman matching Miss Mercer's description. Wanted to know if anyone had seen her." Catherine's hand tightened around her coffee cup. "Why would they care about me? I've already served my purpose. Maybe you know something they think is dangerous," Ezra suggested. "Or maybe Samuel wants to make sure you stay in town where they can control the situation. Either way, we need to be careful," Blackwood said. "I've deputized 4 men I trust, farmers and townspeople who can handle themselves. But against 8 experienced outlaws, we're outmatched unless we're very smart about this." Ezra stood and moved to the window, watching the street below. Timber Ridge was preparing for the Harvest Festival. Banners being hung, stages being built for music and speeches, tables set up for food and craft sales. Innocent people going about their business, unaware of the violence being planned. "We need to know where Samuel and his gang are camped," he said. "If we can scout their position, we might learn more about their plan." "Too dangerous," Blackwood objected. "If they spot you, the whole thing falls apart. They won't spot me." Ezra turned back to face them. "I spent 10 years tracking people who didn't want to be found. I know how to move without being seen." Catherine stood as well. "Then I'm coming with you. 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. "Absolutely not," Ezra said flatly. "You might need someone to stay back and warn the marshal if something goes wrong. Besides, they're looking for me in town. They won't expect me to be out in the wilderness." Her chin lifted stubbornly. "I'm coming." Ezra wanted to argue, but he recognized that determined look. Besides, she had a point about being unexpected, and having someone to send back for help if things went wrong was tactically sound, even if he didn't like putting her at risk. "Fine," he conceded. "But you follow my lead exactly. No improvising." "Understood." "Understood." They left town an hour later on horseback, following the creek northwest into rougher country. Ezra reasoned that Samuel would camp somewhere close enough to watch the town, but far enough to avoid accidental discovery by hunters or travelers. "Tell me about Samuel," Catherine said as they rode. "What was he like before all this?" Ezra was quiet for a moment, remembering. "Charming." That was Samuel's gift. He could talk his way into or out of anything. Made friends easily, always had schemes and dreams. Our mother doted on him. He was the baby, 10 years younger than me. Maybe we spoiled him. "What happened to your parents?" "Father died when Samuel was 12. Heart gave out during harvest. Mother tried to hold the farm together, but it was too much. She sold it and moved to town, took in sewing to make ends meet. I was already married by then, had my own life. Should have paid more attention to Samuel, but I was busy with my own troubles." "You can't blame yourself for his choices," Catherine said gently. "Can't I? He was 17 when he fell in with those outlaws. Still a kid, really. Maybe if I'd been there more, been a better example." He shook his head. "Doesn't matter now. He made his choices, and they led him here." They rode in silence for a while, following game trails that wound through dense pine forest. Ezra read the signs automatically. Broken twigs, disturbed earth, animal droppings. The forest was alive with information, if you knew how to read it. Around midday, he spotted something that made him signal Catherine to stop. Fresh horse tracks, multiple animals, heading east toward a rocky outcrop about a mile ahead. He dismounted and studied the tracks carefully. 8 horses, maybe 9, he whispered.
"Shod carrying weight."
"Passed through here this morning, maybe 3 hours ago. Samuel's gang," Catherine whispered back. "Has to be. No one else would be out here in numbers like that." He considered their options. "We'll leave the horses here and go on foot. Stay behind me and step where I step. If I signal you to freeze, you don't move a muscle. If I signal you to run, you get back to these horses and ride straight to Marshal Blackwood. Don't look back, don't wait for me, clear? Catherine nodded, her face pale but determined. They moved through the forest like ghosts, Ezra leading with the practiced silence of his cavalry days. Every few yards he stopped to listen, to watch for movement, to check the wind direction. Catherine followed his example, placing her feet carefully, avoiding dead branches that might crack. It took them an hour to cover the mile to the rocky outcrop. As they approached, Ezra heard voices, men talking, laughing, the clink of bottles. He signaled Catherine to get low, and they crawled the last 100 yards on their bellies. The gang's camp was well chosen, tucked into a natural shelter formed by boulders and overhung by pines. From this position, they had a clear view of Timber Ridge in the valley below. 8 men lounged around a fire, weapons close at hand. Ezra studied each face, committing them to memory, and then he saw Samuel. 20 years had changed his brother, but the resemblance was still there. Same dark hair, same build, same way of moving. But Samuel's face had hardened, marked by a scar on his left cheek, exactly as the postmaster had described. His eyes, when Ezra could see them, held a coldness that made him seem like a stranger. Samuel was talking to 2 other men, gesturing toward the town. Ezra strained to hear the words, "Tomorrow night, when everyone's drunk and happy. Half of us go in through the front during the music, the other half through the back. In and out in 10 minutes. Ezra will already be in town, conveniently visible, making his usual unfriendly impression. Perfect scapegoat. What about the woman?" one of the others asked. Samuel smiled, and it was a cruel expression. "If she's still alive by then, we'll take her with us. Extra insurance in case Ezra causes trouble. If not," he shrugged, "she served her purpose." Ezra felt Catherine tense beside him, and he put a warning hand on her arm. They needed to hear more, to understand the full plan. "You really think they'll believe Ezra organized this?" another gang member asked. "Man's been a hermit for years." "That's exactly why they'll believe it," Samuel replied. "Hermit gets desperate, decides to make one big score before winter, uses his local knowledge to plan the robbery. It's perfect. And when they hang him for it, I'll finally have my revenge for what he did to me 20 years ago." "What did he do?" the first man asked curiously. Samuel's face darkened. "Turned me into the law. His own brother. Sent me to prison for 5 years, while he went on living his comfortable life. I lost everything because of him. My youth, my future, any chance at a normal life. When I got out, I found out he'd abandoned even his own wife and daughter. Just walked away like none of it mattered." Ezra's grip on Catherine's arm tightened. That wasn't how it had happened. He'd tried to help Samuel, to save him from hanging, and he hadn't abandoned Emma. She died. But Samuel had twisted the truth into something that justified his hatred. "Time to go," Ezra whispered to Catherine. They'd heard enough. They crawled backward carefully, not daring to stand until they were well clear of the camp. Then they moved quickly through the forest, no longer concerned with stealth, just speed. They reached the horses and mounted, turning back toward Timber Ridge. "He hates you," Catherine said as they rode. "Really hates you." "I know." Ezra's voice was heavy. "And he's convinced himself I'm the villain in his story. Nothing I say will change that." "What are you going to do?" "Stop him. Save this town, and then—" Ezra paused. "Then I'll try to make him understand the truth, even if it doesn't change anything." They reached Timber Ridge as the sun was setting, and found Marshal Blackwood waiting anxiously in his office. Ezra laid out everything they'd learned. The gang's position, their numbers, their timeline, their plan. "Tomorrow night during the festival," Blackwood said grimly. "We've got less than a day to prepare." "Then we'd better get started," Ezra replied. As they worked through the night, planning positions and contingencies, Ezra found himself repeatedly looking at Catherine. She'd been dragged into this through no fault of her own, used as a pawn in Samuel's revenge scheme. But instead of running, instead of collapsing under the weight of it all, she was standing firm. "Thank you," he said quietly when they took a break near midnight. "For what?" Catherine asked. "For staying, for helping. You didn't have to." She smiled, tired but genuine. "Yes, I did. Someone once told me that when you're knocked down, you either stay down or you stand up fighting. I'm choosing to stand. Ezra realized he'd never said those words to her, but somehow she'd learned the lesson anyway. And watching her now, preparing to face danger with courage she'd found in herself, he felt something shift in his chest. The first stirring of something beyond respect, beyond gratitude. But that was a thought for another time. Tomorrow they had a robbery to stop and a brother to confront. The mountains seemed very distant indeed. The harvest festival began at noon with music and celebration. Main Street was packed with farmers and families, children running between the stalls, the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread filling the air. To any casual observer, it was a perfect autumn day in Timber Ridge. No one noticed the armed men positioned at strategic points, or the tension in Marshal Blackwood's shoulders as he moved through the crowd. Ezra stood near the general store, watching the bank across the street. Catherine was positioned in the store's second-floor window with a rifle, her view commanding the entire street. 4 deputized townsmen were scattered throughout the crowd, trying to look casual while staying alert. The plan was simple. Let Samuel's gang start their move, identify all the members, then close the trap before they could hurt anyone or reach the bank's vault. Risky, but it gave them the best chance of catching the entire gang at once. Hours passed. The afternoon wore on. Music played, people danced, children laughed. Ezra began to wonder if they'd gotten the timing wrong, if Samuel had somehow learned they were waiting. Then just as the sun touched the western peaks and long shadows stretched across the street, he saw them. 2 men in working clothes moved through the crowd with purpose, heading toward the bank's back entrance. Ezra recognized them from the camp. He gave a subtle signal to Marshal Blackwood, who nodded and began moving into position. More movement caught Ezra's eye. 3 more men approaching the bank's front door, trying to look like ordinary customers. The coordinated timing was precise, professional. These weren't amateurs. But where was Samuel? Ezra scanned the crowd, searching for his brother's face. Samuel should be leading this, should be visible, giving orders. Instead, the gang members were moving like they were following a predetermined plan. No leadership in sight. Something felt wrong. The first shot shattered the festival's cheerful noise. One of the gang members had drawn his weapon on a bank guard, and suddenly everyone was screaming and running. The carefully organized ambush dissolved into chaos as the gang members opened fire, not just at the bank, but into the crowd. "They know!" Ezra shouted, realizing too late. "It's a diversion!" Marshal Blackwood understood immediately. While everyone was focused on the bank robbery, the real target had to be somewhere else. But where? Then Ezra heard it. An explosion from the north end of town, near the assayer's office. The assayer's office, where the week's gold deposits from the mines were stored, waiting for the monthly transport to Denver. "The gold!" Blackwood yelled. "They were never after the bank." Ezra sprinted toward the explosion, rifle in hand. Behind him he heard Catherine calling his name, but he couldn't stop. The gang at the bank was just a distraction, sacrificial pawns to draw attention, while the real robbery happened elsewhere. He reached the assayer's office to find the door blown off its hinges, smoke pouring from the interior. 2 bodies lay in the street, the assayer and his clerk, both shot. Ezra entered carefully, checking corners the way he'd been trained decades ago. The safe was open, its door hanging crookedly from damaged hinges. Empty. Someone had gotten here fast, taken the gold, and vanished. Ezra emerged back onto the street and looked around frantically, trying to think like Samuel. Where would you go? How would you escape with everyone converging on this location? Then he saw the horses, 4 of them, already saddled, tied behind the boarding house. Samuel had planned this perfectly. While everyone rushed toward the explosion, he'd calmly load the gold and ride out the back way. Ezra ran toward the horses, but he was too slow. Samuel emerged from the boarding house carrying saddlebags heavy with gold and saw his brother approaching. For a moment, they locked eyes across 30 yards of distance. Samuel smiled. That same charming smile Ezra remembered from their youth, now twisted with malice. "Hello, brother. Wondered when you'd figure it out." "It's over, Samuel." Ezra called, raising his rifle. "There's nowhere to go." "Isn't there?" Samuel gestured, and Ezra heard movement behind him. He turned to find two more gang members emerging. From the alley, and between them, held at gunpoint, was Catherine. Ezra's blood went cold. She was supposed to be safe in the general store. How had they gotten to her? "Drop the rifle, Ezra," Samuel said pleasantly, "or my men put a bullet in your lady friend. I know you don't care about much these days, but I saw how you looked at her." "You care about her." Ezra's mind raced through options, calculating odds, looking for any opening. But with two guns pointed at Catherine's head, he had no choice. He lowered his rifle slowly, set it on the ground. "Good," Samuel said. "Now here's what's going to happen. You're going to let us ride out of here. In exchange, we'll leave the woman alive. Try to follow us, try to get help, and she dies. Simple transaction." "Why?" Ezra asked, trying to buy time. "Why all this? The elaborate scheme, the letters, bringing Catherine here. Why not just rob the gold and disappear?" Samuel's smile faded, replaced by cold fury. "Because I wanted you to suffer. I wanted you to watch as I destroyed the only good thing that had happened to you in 15 years. You took everything from me, Ezra. My freedom, my future, my life. Now I'm taking something from you." "I tried to help you," Ezra said. "I tried to save your life by sending me to prison. That's your idea of help." Samuel laughed bitterly. "I spent 5 years in that hell because of you. 5 years of beatings and hunger and violence. When I got out, I learned you'd left your own family, walked away from your wife and child like they meant nothing. That's when I understood. You destroy everything you touch. It's what you do." "Emma died," Ezra said quietly. "She didn't leave. She died. I never abandoned her." For just a second, confusion crossed Samuel's face. "Margaret told me you left them." "Margaret lied to you, or you misunderstood. Emma died of fever when she was 8 months old. Margaret and I separated because we couldn't survive the grief together. I didn't abandon anyone. I was destroyed by losing my daughter." Samuel's certainty wavered, and Ezra pressed the advantage. "Whatever Margaret told you, whatever you think happened, you have it wrong. I spent 15 years in those mountains punishing myself for failing Emma, for not saving her. I didn't walk away from responsibility. I drowned in it." "You're lying," Samuel said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I? Look at me, Samuel, really look. Do I look like someone who's been living easy all these years? Or do I look like someone who's been dying slowly?" Before Samuel could respond, gunfire erupted from the direction of the bank. The distraction was all Ezra needed. He dove for his rifle while shouting at Catherine, "Down!" Catherine dropped to the ground as Ezra came up shooting. He hit one of Samuel's men in the shoulder, sending him spinning away. The other ducked behind a water trough, returning fire. Samuel had already mounted his horse, the saddlebags of gold secured behind him. Marshal Blackwood and 2 deputies came running around the corner, weapons drawn. The gang members at the bank had apparently been subdued, and now the marshal was bringing reinforcements. Samuel's remaining men realized they were trapped. One threw down his weapon and raised his hands. The other tried to make a run for it and took a bullet in the leg from Blackwood's rifle. Samuel sat on his horse, surrounded, the gold still in his possession. He looked at Ezra with an expression that mixed hatred, confusion, and something that might have been regret. "It's over," Ezra repeated. "Surrender the gold and come down. Please, Samuel, don't make this end the way you've been headed all these years." For a long moment, Samuel's hand hovered over his pistol. Ezra could see him calculating odds, considering his options. Then slowly, Samuel's shoulders sagged. "You really didn't abandon them?" he asked quietly. "Never. Emma's death destroyed me. I've spent 15 years trying to learn to live with that guilt." Samuel closed his eyes. When he opened them again, some of the fury had drained away, leaving behind exhaustion. "I've been carrying this hatred for so long, built my whole life around it. If what you're saying is true, it's true. And Samuel, what happened to you 20 years ago? I really was trying to help." The sheriff said if you testified, he could get you a lighter sentence. I was trying to save you from hanging. I thought you betrayed me, Samuel whispered. I thought you chose the law over your own brother. I chose your life over my pride, and I've regretted that you never understood that every day since. Marshal Blackwood moved closer, weapon still trained on Samuel. Time to make a decision, son. You can end this with dignity or you can end it badly, but it's ending either way. Samuel looked at the gold, then at the guns pointed at him, then at his brother. Finally, he unstrapped the saddlebags and let them fall to the ground with a heavy thud. He dismounted slowly, hands raised. I'm sorry, Ezra, he said as the marshal's deputies moved in to restrain him. For all of it. For what I did to that woman, for the people who died today, for the years I wasted hating you. Ezra approached. His brother, standing close enough to see the tears tracking down Samuel's scarred face. I'm sorry too. Sorry I wasn't there when you needed me. Sorry I couldn't save you from the path you chose. As the deputies led Samuel away, Ezra felt Catherine's hand slip into his. She was shaking but alive, her face smudged with dirt, but her eyes clear and strong. Are you all right? He asked. I am now, she replied. They grabbed me when I tried to follow you. I should have stayed put like we planned. You should have, he agreed, but I'm glad you're safe. They stood together, watching as the aftermath of the robbery played out around them, injured being tended, bodies being covered, the chaos slowly resolving into order. The harvest festival had turned into a tragedy, with 3 townspeople dead and several more wounded. But Samuel's gang was captured, the gold recovered, and Ezra's name cleared of the frame job. It should have felt like victory. Instead, Ezra just felt tired and old and sad for all the wasted years, his and Samuel's both. What happens now? Catherine asked. Ezra looked toward the mountains, then at the woman beside him. I don't know. I guess we figure it out together. The next morning found Ezra sitting alone in Marshal Blackwood's office, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The town was quiet now, the festival debris being cleaned up, families grieving their dead, people trying to make sense of what had happened. Samuel was in a cell in the back room, awaiting transport to Denver for trial. The surviving gang members were locked up with him, facing charges of robbery and murder. It should have been simple. Justice served, case closed. But nothing about any of this felt simple to Ezra. Marshal Blackwood entered, looking as exhausted as Ezra felt. Thought I'd find you here. You've been sitting in this chair for 3 hours. Have I? Ezra realized he'd lost track of time, his mind turning over everything that had happened. The judge will be here in 2 days to take statements. They'll transport the prisoners after that. Blackwood poured himself coffee. Your testimony will be crucial. Between what we found in that journal and your account of what Samuel said, we've got a solid case. He'll hang, Ezra said flatly. Probably. 3 people died yesterday, and he planned the whole thing. Even if he didn't pull the trigger himself, he's responsible. Blackwood sat down across from Ezra. You can't save him this time. I know. Ezra's voice was rough, but that doesn't make it easier. Have you talked to him since we locked him up? Ezra shook his head. What would I say? Everything's already been said. Maybe, or maybe there are things that still need saying. Blackwood stood and pulled out a ring of keys. Come on, I'll give you some privacy. Ezra followed the marshal to the cells. Samuel sat on a narrow cot, staring at the wall. He looked smaller than he had yesterday, diminished by the weight of what he'd done. When Ezra approached the bars, Samuel looked up. Didn't think you'd come, Samuel said. Neither did I. Ezra pulled up a chair and sat. Blackwood disappeared, leaving them alone. I've been trying to figure out what to say to you. Don't suppose goodbye covers it. No. Ezra was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about when we were kids. Remember how you used to follow me everywhere? I couldn't take a step without you right behind me, asking questions, wanting to help with whatever I was doing. A ghost of a smile crossed Samuel's face. You used to get so annoyed. Tell me to go play with kids my own age. I was a poor excuse for a big brother, Ezra admitted. Too caught up in my own life to pay attention to yours. By the time I realized you were in trouble, it was too late. That's not true. You tried to help when I got arrested. I couldn't see it that way at the time. All I saw was you talking to the sheriff, making deals, and I felt betrayed. Samuel leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The other men in that gang, they convinced me you'd sold me out. Said family doesn't send family to prison. I believed them, and you spent 20 years hating me for it. I did. That hate kept me alive in prison, gave me something to focus on besides the horror of every day. When I got out, I tracked down Margaret. She told me you'd abandoned your family, left your wife and baby without a word. It confirmed everything I believed about you, that you were selfish, that you destroyed people. She lied to you, Ezra said. Or maybe she believed her own version of events. Grief does strange things to people's memories. I know that now, but for 20 years I built my whole identity around revenge. Learned to be what I needed to be to hurt you. Patient, calculating, ruthless. The old Samuel died in prison. What came out was something else. Ezra studied his brother's face, seeing the boy he remembered buried beneath years of hardness and pain. Is there any of that boy left? The one who used to help Mother in the garden? Who made me laugh with his silly jokes? Samuel's eyes grew wet. I don't know. I killed him along the way, I think. Killed him so I could survive. I did something similar, Ezra confessed. After Emma died, I killed the part of me that could feel joy, that could hope for things, that could connect with other people. Went up into those mountains and buried myself alive. We're not so different, you and me. We both ran from pain instead of facing it. What changed for you? Samuel asked. Ezra thought of Catherine, of how her unexpected arrival had cracked open the walls he'd built. Someone reminded me that being alive and being dead aren't the same thing, that I could choose to keep living, really living, instead of just existing. The woman. Catherine. Samuel's face twisted with shame. I used her terribly, played on her loneliness, her desperation, made her think she was coming to something good when I was really just using her as bait. That's something I can never take back. No, you can't. But you can acknowledge what you did was wrong. You can mean it when you say you're sorry. I'm sorry. To her, to you, to the families of the people who died yesterday. I'm sorry for all of it. Samuel stood and gripped the cell bars. But sorry doesn't bring anyone back. Doesn't undo the harm. I'm going to hang Ezra, and maybe I deserve to. Maybe you do, Ezra said quietly. But that doesn't mean I won't mourn you. You're still my brother. Broken, twisted by pain and bad choices. But still my brother. They stood in silence, separated by iron bars, but connected by blood and shared history. Finally, Samuel spoke again. That woman, Catherine, she's good for you. I saw how you looked at her, how you moved to protect her without thinking. Don't let her go. Don't make the same mistakes we both made, choosing isolation over connection. I don't know if she'll want to stay. I don't know if I have anything to offer her besides a cabin in the wilderness and a man who's still figuring out how to live again. Then figure it out together. Promise me that, Ezra. Promise me that something good comes out of all this mess. Let my mistakes lead you towards something better. Ezra reached through the bars and gripped his brother's hand. I promise. Marshal Blackwood returned then, clearing his throat to announce his presence. Time's up, Ezra. Got to get back to procedures. Ezra stood but didn't immediately release Samuel's hand. I'll come back before they transport you to Denver. Don't, Samuel said. This is goodbye, brother. Let it be here like this. I don't want you watching them take me away in chains. Ezra wanted to argue, but he saw the pleading in Samuel's eyes and understood. This was Samuel's last request, the final thing he could control. All right. Goodbye, Samuel. Goodbye, Ezra. Thank you for coming. For listening. For not hating me as much as I hated you. I could never hate you. I just wish... I know. Me too. Ezra left the jail with his chest tight and his eyes burning. Outside, Catherine waited on the boardwalk, wrapped in a shawl against the morning chill. She didn't ask how it went. She just fell into step beside him as they walked. They ended up at the edge of town, looking up toward the mountains. Ezra's cabin was up there somewhere, waiting in its clearing. His old life calling him back. What are you thinking? Catherine asked softly. That I need to decide what kind of life I want to live. The one I had before you arrived or something else? And have you decided? Ezra turned to face her. I spent 15 years running from pain, from connection, from anything that might hurt me again. I thought I was protecting myself, but really I was just dying slowly. You showing up, this whole mess with Samuel, it forced me to face things I'd been avoiding. I didn't mean to disrupt your life, Catherine said. I know, but I'm glad you did. He took her hands in his, feeling how small and strong they were. Catherine, I'm not an easy man. I'm damaged, set in my ways, carrying ghosts that will never fully leave. I can't promise you comfort or security beyond what my hands can build. But I can promise honesty. I can promise that I'll try to be more than the broken hermit you found. Catherine's eyes searched his face. What are you asking me, Ezra? To stay, to give us a chance to see if what started as a cruel deception might become something real, to help me figure out how to live again instead of just survive. I thought you'd never ask, she said, and smiled through tears. I have nothing to go back to in St. Louis. No family, no home, nothing but memories of loneliness. But here, she gestured at the mountains, the town, the vast wilderness beyond. Here I found something I didn't even know I was looking for. What's that? Purpose, courage I didn't know I had, and a man who's brave enough to face his pain instead of running from it. She squeezed his hands. Yes, Ezra, I'll stay. I'll take the chance if you will. Relief flooded through him, so powerful it nearly buckled his knees. He pulled her close, holding her carefully, as if she might disappear if he gripped too tight. She fit against him perfectly, her head tucked under his chin, her arms wrapped around his waist. Thank you, he whispered into her hair. They stood like that for a long time. Two people who'd been broken by life finding shelter in each other. Around them, Timber Ridge slowly came back to life, people emerging from homes, shops opening, the daily rhythms resuming despite yesterday's tragedy. Marshal Blackwood found them there an hour later. Judge arrived early, he said. Wants to take statements today. You both ready? Ezra and Catherine exchanged a look, then nodded. Ready, they said together. The next hours passed in a blur of testimony and legal procedures. Ezra laid out everything. Samuel's journal, the gang's plan, the confrontation, the confession. Catherine described her role, how she'd been manipulated and used. The witnesses added their accounts. The postmaster, Mrs. Sawyer, townspeople who'd seen various parts of the scheme unfold. By late afternoon, the judge had heard enough. This is clearly a case of premeditated robbery and conspiracy to commit murder. The prisoners will be transported to Denver for trial. Given the evidence and the deaths involved, I expect the sentences will be severe. Hanging, Ezra said quietly after the proceedings ended. Samuel will hang. Yes, Marshal Blackwood confirmed. I'm sorry, Ezra. I know he's your brother. He made his choices. I can't save him from the consequences. But saying it didn't make it hurt less. That evening, Ezra retrieved his old cavalry rifle from where he'd stored it at the livery stable. The weapon was 20 years old, but still functional, still deadly. He'd carried it through campaigns against hostile tribes, through skirmishes and ambushes, through situations where his life had depended on his skill and this rifle's accuracy. He hadn't touched it in 15 years. Hadn't wanted to remember the man he'd been, the soldier who'd killed without hesitation when necessary. But that man's skills had saved Catherine and stopped Samuel. That man was still part of him. Whether he wanted to acknowledge it or not, Catherine found him cleaning the rifle in the boarding house room. She sat beside him, watching his practiced hands work oil into metal and wood. You're thinking about going back to the cabin, she observed. I am, but not alone. Not anymore. He set the rifle aside and took her hand. Come with me. Help me turn that lonely place into a home. It won't be easy. Winters are harsh, supplies are limited, and we'll be miles from other people. But it's honest work, clean air, and room to heal. When do we leave? She asked simply. Tomorrow. No point in staying here longer than we need to. I'll get supplies, make arrangements. We'll head up before the next snow. Then tomorrow it is. Catherine leaned her head on his shoulder. Ezra, what if I'm not strong enough? What if I can't handle the isolation and hardship? You walked through the wilderness alone to reach my cabin. You faced down outlaws without flinching. You have a strength you haven't fully discovered yet." He kissed the top of her head gently. "And this time, you won't be alone. We'll face whatever comes together." That night, Ezra stood at the window of his room, looking toward the mountains. Tomorrow he'd return to that cabin, to the life he'd built from nothing. But this time, everything would be different. He wouldn't be running from pain. He'd be walking towards something new. Behind him, Catherine slept peacefully in the chair, exhausted from the day's ordeal. Ezra watched her in the lamplight, this unexpected woman who'd shattered his carefully constructed solitude and reminded him what it meant to be human. Samuel's last words echoed in his mind. Let something good come from all this mess. Maybe that's exactly what was happening. From the ashes of revenge and deception, from the ruins of two broken lives, something new was growing. Something that might, with time and care, become love. The mountains waited, patient and eternal. And for the first time in 15 years, Ezra Thornwell looked forward to going home. The church bell rang at dawn, its clear tone cutting through the morning mist. Ezra woke to the sound, momentarily disoriented, then remembered. It was Sunday, and the town was gathering to mourn their dead and give thanks for their survival. Marshal Blackwood had suggested Ezra and Catherine attend, to show the community they had nothing to hide, that they too were victims of Samuel's scheme. Ezra dressed carefully in the one good shirt he owned, borrowed from the general store since his own clothes were all rough work garments. Catherine wore a simple dress Mrs. Sawyer had loaned her, dark blue and respectable. They walked to the church together, aware of eyes watching them from windows and doorways. The church was packed, every pew filled, people standing along the walls. Reverend Morrison stood at the pulpit, his white hair gleaming in the morning light streaming through the windows. He was an old man, well into his 70s, but his voice was still strong. "We gather today in sorrow and in gratitude," he began. "3 of our own have been taken from us, John Miller, his son Daniel, and Sarah Pritchard. Their deaths wound us all. But we also give thanks that the violence was stopped before more lives were lost. And we acknowledge those who stood between evil and our community." His gaze found Ezra in the back pew, and others turned to look. Ezra felt Catherine's hand tighten in his. "Ezra Thornwell hasn't been among us for many years," the Reverend continued. "He chose a path of solitude, carrying burdens we can only imagine. Yesterday, he could have ridden back to his mountain refuge when trouble came. Instead, he stayed and fought. He helped protect this town from men who would have destroyed us. That kind of courage deserves our recognition and our thanks." Someone in the front started clapping, and soon the entire congregation was applauding. Ezra felt heat rise in his face, uncomfortable with the attention. He wasn't a hero, he'd just done what needed doing. But Catherine leaned close and whispered, "Accept it with grace. They need to thank you." So Ezra nodded his acknowledgement, and the applause faded. The service continued with prayers for the dead, hymns of comfort and hope. When it ended, people approached Ezra and Catherine, shaking hands, expressing gratitude, asking questions about what had happened. An older woman named Mrs. Henderson gripped Ezra's hand with surprising strength. "Your mother would be proud of you," she said. "I knew Margaret Thornwell. She was a good woman who raised good sons. One of them went wrong, but you came through when it mattered." Ezra felt emotion clog his throat. He'd forgotten that people in this town had known his mother, had connections to his past. "Thank you, ma'am. That means more than you know." Outside the church, Marshal Blackwood waited with news. "Prisoners are being transported this afternoon. Wagons coming from Denver with armed guards. Samuel asked to see you one more time before they leave." Ezra had told Samuel goodbye yesterday, had meant it to be final. But looking at Blackwood's serious expression, he understood there was something more. "What is it?" "What's happened?" "He wants to make a full confession. On the record, signed and witnessed. Says there are things about the gang's activities that law enforcement needs to know. Robberies in other territories, accomplices still at large. But he'll only talk to you first." Catherine touched Ezra's arm. "Go, I'll wait at the boarding house." "You sure? He's your brother. You need to do this." Ezra followed Blackwood back to the jail. Samuel looked worse than he had yesterday, pale, with dark circles under his eyes. He stood when Ezra approached the cell. "Thank you for coming. I know you said goodbye already. Marshall says you want to make a confession about the gang's other crimes. I do. But first, I need to give you something." Samuel reached under his cot and pulled out a small wooden box, no bigger than a book. "I've carried this for 20 years. It belongs to you, not me." He passed the box through the bars. Ezra opened it carefully and found himself staring at a photograph, his mother young and smiling, holding a baby. Him, he realized. This was him as an infant in his mother's arms. "Mother gave me this the week before she died," Samuel said. "She'd kept it hidden away, said it was too painful to look at after Father passed. But she wanted me to have it, wanted me to remember that you were a good brother once, before life got complicated." Beneath the photograph were letters, dozens of them, yellowed with age. Ezra unfolded one and recognized his own handwriting from 20 years ago. Letters he'd written to Samuel while serving in the cavalry, full of stories about the frontier, advice about staying out of trouble, expressions of brotherly affection. "I kept every one," Samuel said quietly. "Even when I hated you, I couldn't throw them away. They reminded me of who we used to be before everything went wrong." Ezra's vision blurred. He'd forgotten these letters, forgotten that version of himself who'd cared deeply about his younger brother's future. "Samuel, I want you to have them back. I want you to remember that love existed between us once, that not everything was ruined." Samuel's voice broke. "I want you to remember me as more than the man who tried to destroy you. Remember me as your little brother who followed you everywhere, who looked up to you, who loved you before hate poisoned everything." Ezra set the box down carefully and reached through the bars to grip Samuel's shoulder. "I remember, Sam, I've always remembered. The hate was recent, the love was first. Love was always first." They stood like that, two brothers separated by iron and choices, connected by blood and memory. Outside, Ezra heard the sound of wagon wheels, the transport from Denver arriving. "Time to go," Marshal Blackwood said gently from the doorway. "I'm ready," Samuel said. He looked at Ezra one last time. "Take care of her, Catherine. Make her happy. Build something good." "I will. Then I can face what's coming knowing something worthwhile survived all this." Samuel smiled, sad but genuine. "Goodbye, big brother. Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I deserved it. Goodbye, Sam." Ezra turned away before the deputies came to shackle Samuel and lead him to the wagon. He couldn't watch that part. Outside, he stood in the street, clutching the wooden box, feeling the weight of 20 years of brotherhood compressed into one small container. Catherine found him there a few minutes later. She didn't ask questions, just stood beside him as the prison wagon rolled past, heading east toward Denver and justice. Inside, Samuel pressed his face to the barred window, looking back at his brother one final time. Then the wagon turned the corner and was gone. They left Timber Ridge the next morning, before most of the town was awake. Ezra had purchased supplies: flour, salt, coffee, ammunition, fabric for clothes, seeds for next spring's garden. Everything loaded onto his mule, with his 2 horses carrying them. Catherine rode the gentler of the 2, a bay mare named Rosie, who'd been his most reliable companion for years. The journey up the mountain took most of the day. Catherine had walked this path once before in desperation and darkness. Now in daylight with Ezra beside her, she saw it differently. The beauty of the aspens turning gold, the crystal clarity of the streams, the vast silence broken only by wind and wildlife. "It's magnificent," she said, as they paused at a ridge overlooking the valley below. "I understand why you stayed." "It's home," Ezra replied simply. "The only place I felt I belonged after everything fell apart." They reached the cabin as the sun touched the western peaks. The clearing looked exactly as Ezra had left it, peaceful, isolated, untouched by the chaos that had consumed the past week. Catherine dismounted and stood looking at the sturdy log structure, the hand-carved door with its marks and scars. "This is where our story really began," she said. "When I stumbled here in my ruined wedding dress, thinking my life was about to start and finding a stubborn hermit who wanted nothing to do with you," Ezra finished. He came to stand beside her. I'm sorry for that. For my coldness when you first arrived. Don't be. You were protecting yourself, and you had good reason. I was a stranger making impossible claims. She turned to face him. But we've both come a long way since then. You let me in, let me see your pain. That took courage. They spent the rest of the evening settling in. Ezra started a fire while Catherine explored the cabin more thoroughly than she'd been able to that first chaotic night. She noted places that needed attention. A window that let in drafts, floorboards that creaked, shelves that could be added for better storage. I could make curtains, she said, examining the bare windows. And maybe we could build a proper bed frame instead of just furs on the floor. We, Ezra asked, and she heard the hope in his voice. We, she confirmed. Unless you've changed your mind about me staying. Never. He crossed to her and took her hands. Catherine, there's something I need to say. Something I should have said days ago. What is it? He struggled for words, this man who'd spent 15 years in silence. When you first arrived, you thought you were coming to marry me. That was a lie, a cruel deception. But now I find myself wishing it had been true. Not the way it happened, but the outcome. You here with me? Catherine's heart raced. Ezra, what are you asking? I'm asking if you consider making it real. Not right away. I know we barely know each other and rushing into marriage would be foolish. But in time, when we're both sure, when we've built something solid between us, would you marry me? For real this time? She searched his weathered face, saw the vulnerability there, the fear of rejection mixing with fragile hope. This man who'd lost so much, who'd isolated himself for so long, was offering her everything he had left. Yes, she said softly. When the time is right, when we've earned each other's trust fully, yes, Ezra. I'll marry you. He pulled her close, and they stood wrapped together as darkness fell outside and the fire crackled warmly. For the first time since Emma's death, Ezra felt something like happiness stirring in his chest, tentative, fragile, but unmistakably real. They spent the next weeks settling into a rhythm. Catherine proved herself capable and resourceful, learning the skills needed for mountain living. Ezra taught her to shoot accurately, to read weather signs, to preserve food for winter. She taught him to laugh again, to find joy in small moments, to talk about feelings instead of burying them. One evening, as the first snow began to fall, they sat by the fire and Catherine asked about Samuel. Have you heard anything? Letter came from Marshal Blackwood last week, Ezra said. Trial was quick. Samuel confessed to everything, gave testimony about the gang's other crimes, helped law enforcement close cases across 3 territories. What was his sentence? Hanging. Set for December 1st, Ezra stared into the flames. 3 weeks from now, Catherine took his hand. I'm sorry. I know he did terrible things, but he was still your brother. He was. And in the end, he tried to make amends. Helped bring justice for other crimes, gave me back those letters and the photograph. It doesn't erase what he did, but it means something. He died trying to be better than what he'd become. Will you go? To Denver. Ezra shook his head. He asked me not to. Said he wanted me to remember him as we were in that jail cell, not at the end of a rope. I'm honoring that request. They sat in silence, mourning the man Samuel had been and the man he might have become. Outside, snow continued falling, covering the world in white, making everything clean and new. Life is so fragile, Catherine said. We get so little time, and it's so easy to waste it on hate or fear or isolation. Yes, Ezra agreed, which is why we can't waste what we've been given. Second chances are rare. We need to make this one count. Catherine leaned her head on his shoulder. We will. Together we will. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. 2 people who'd been alone were alone no longer. 2 lives that had been broken were being carefully, patiently mended. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging. But inside the cabin, everything had changed. Love had found a way into the darkness, bringing with it the promise of healing and hope. The hermit and the lost bride had found each other through deception and chaos. But what they built together would be real, earned through honesty, trust, and the courage to face the future side by side. Spring came to the mountains with a rush of melting snow and the return of birds. Ezra stood on the porch. He and Catherine had expanded together over the winter months, watching the valley below come alive with color. 6 months had passed since that October day when a woman in a ruined wedding dress had appeared at his door and changed everything. Catherine emerged from the cabin, drying her hands on her apron. She'd made the apron herself from fabric they'd purchased during their monthly trip to Timber Ridge, sewn by lamplight while Ezra read aloud from the books they'd accumulated. Her face had lost the hollow, desperate look it had carried when they first met. Now she glowed with health and something else, contentment maybe, or purpose. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, joining him at the railing, just remembering how different things were 6 months ago. How different I was. We both were. She slipped her hand into his, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Do you regret it? Letting me stay?" "Not for a second." He turned to face her fully. "Catherine, there's something I want to talk to you about," she smiled. "Is this the conversation I've been waiting for?" "It might be." He pulled a small object from his pocket, a ring he'd forged himself from mountain silver, simple but carefully crafted. The design was engraved with tiny mountain peaks circling the band. "I made this during the long nights when you were sleeping. Kept it hidden, waiting for the right moment." Catherine's eyes grew bright with tears. "Ezra, let me finish. 6 months ago I was barely living. I was existing, going through motions, waiting for the years to pass. Then you arrived and everything changed. You reminded me what it means to be human, to connect with someone, to hope for more than just survival." He took her hand and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "Catherine Mercer, will you marry me? For real this time, not because of false letters or schemes, but because we've chosen each other." "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at once. "Yes, of course, yes. I've been waiting for you to ask since that night you first suggested it." He kissed her then, gentle and thorough, sealing the promise they were making. When they pulled apart, Catherine was smiling through her tears. "When?" she asked. "Whenever you want. We could go to Timber Ridge this week, have Reverend Morrison marry us, or we could wait until summer when the wildflowers bloom. Your choice." "This week," she said firmly. "I don't want to wait any longer. We've already wasted enough time. You in your isolation, me in my loneliness. Let's start our real life together now." They made the journey to Timber Ridge 3 days later. The town greeted them warmly now, no longer suspicious or curious, just accepting. Ezra had become a regular presence again, no longer the mysterious hermit, but simply one of them. Marshal Blackwood was among the first to congratulate them. "About time you made an honest woman of her," he said with a grin. "Whole town's been wondering when you'd get around to proposing." "Town needs to mind its own business," Ezra grumbled, but there was no heat in it. The wedding took place on a perfect spring morning. The church was full again, but this time with joy instead of mourning. Catherine wore a new dress she'd made herself, pale blue with white lace at the collar. Ezra wore his best clothes, uncomfortable in the formal attire, but willing to endure it for her. Reverend Morrison performed the ceremony with gentle warmth. These two people have traveled unusual roads to reach this moment. They've faced deception, danger, and their own inner demons. But through it all, they've chosen to stand together. That's what marriage is, not the absence of hardship, but the commitment to face it together. When Ezra slipped the silver ring onto Catherine's finger, she'd insisted on wearing the one he'd made. Not buying something fancier, his hand was steady. When Catherine spoke her vows, her voice rang clear and sure. And when Reverend Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, the congregation erupted in applause and cheering. The celebration afterward was simple but heartfelt. The townspeople had prepared food, and someone brought out a fiddle for dancing. Ezra, who hadn't danced in 20 years, found himself swaying awkwardly with Catherine, while people laughed and clapped. "I'm terrible at this," he muttered. "You're perfect," Catherine replied, and meant it. As the sun began to set, they prepared to ride back to their cabin. Mrs. Henderson approached with a bundle wrapped in cloth. "Your mother's wedding quilt," she said, pressing it into Catherine's hands. "I've been keeping it safe all these years. Margaret didn't want it when she left, but I couldn't bear to sell it or give it away. It belongs with family," Catherine unwrapped the quilt carefully, revealing intricate stitching in patterns of mountains and stars. It's beautiful. Thank you for preserving it. Your mother would be happy, Mrs. Henderson told Ezra. She'd be so happy to see you living again, choosing love instead of grief. They rode home as darkness fell. The wedding quilt wrapped around Catherine's shoulders, Ezra's arms steady around her waist. When they reached the cabin, the sight that greeted them stopped them both. Someone, probably Marshal Blackwood and some of the townspeople, had decorated the porch with wildflowers and lanterns. A new bench sat beside the door, crafted from pine and polished smooth. A note attached read, "For your future children to sit and watch the sunrise." "Welcome home, Mr. and Mrs. Thornwell." Catherine's hand went to her stomach, where a secret she'd only just confirmed was growing. She'd planned to tell Ezra tonight, on their wedding night. But looking at this gift, this expression of community and hope, she couldn't wait. "Ezra," she said softly, "there's something you should know. That bench, it's going to be used sooner than they probably expected." He looked at her, confusion giving way to understanding, then to wonder. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying we're going to have a baby, sometime in late autumn, I think." For a moment, Ezra couldn't breathe. The fear crashed over him, memories of Emma, of holding his dying daughter, of failing to save her. But then Catherine took his face in her hands and made him look at her. "I know you're scared. I know what happened before. But this isn't then, and I'm not Margaret. We'll face this together. We'll get the best doctor from Denver if we need to. We'll prepare and plan and do everything right. But most importantly, we'll love this child without letting fear poison that love." Ezra pulled her close, feeling tears track down his weathered face for the second time in 6 months. "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I'm strong enough. You are. And you won't be doing it alone. That's what marriage means, remember? Facing things together." He thought of Samuel's last words. Let something good come from all this mess. Here it was. New life growing from the ashes of old pain, hope rising from despair, a family being born from two broken people choosing to heal together. "A baby," he whispered, letting the reality sink in. "We're going to have a baby." "Yes," Catherine said, smiling through her own tears. "Are you happy?" Terrified," he admitted. "But yes, happy. More happy than I thought I'd ever be again." They stood on their porch as night settled over the mountains, wrapped in his mother's wedding quilt, contemplating the future. The past couldn't be changed. Emma was still gone. Samuel was still dead. The years of isolation couldn't be recovered. But the future stretched out before them, full of possibility. Ezra wound his pocket watch, Emma's watch, which now kept time again. The steady tick marked moments passing, life continuing, hope persisting. He'd carried that stopped watch for 15 years as a monument to grief. Now it would measure the hours of his new life, ticking toward a future that included love, family, and second chances. "Thank you," he said to Catherine, "for being lost that day, for stumbling into my life, for refusing to give up on either of us." "Thank you for opening your door," she replied, "for taking a chance on a desperate woman in a wedding dress, for teaching me that I'm stronger than I knew." They went inside together, into the cabin that had been a hermitage, and was now a home. Outside, the mountains stood eternal, witness to one man's journey from death back to life, from isolation to connection, from despair to hope. Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best destinations. Sometimes deception points toward truth. Sometimes a woman in a tattered wedding dress and a broken man in the wilderness find exactly what they've both been searching for. Not in the life they planned, but in the life they built together from the ruins of their separate sorrows. The hermit was alone no more. The lost bride had found her home, and in the quiet of the mountain night, two hearts that had been shattered found their way to wholeness, not through forgetting the past, but through having the courage to embrace the future together.